Love it or hate it, Isekai has had a veritable stranglehold on anime, manga, and light novels for years at this point. The continued dominance and popularity of these types of stories has triggered no shortage of commentary regarding why this specific storytelling device remains so popular. In fact, the very first video I made for this channel was on this very question. But today I want to take a different approach. What if there is a scientific explanation for the evergreen popularity of isekai stories? Perhaps the annals of peer-reviewed academic literature secretly holds the answer to this query. After perusing the realms of psychology, sociology, media studies, cultural anthropology, among others, I've developed 3 buckets from which we can understand the enduring popularity of isekai. The first is psychological. The story structure of isekai allows viewers to better connect and immerse themselves in the work. The second is sociological. The mechanics of isekai are particularly appealing to a growing class of young people who are disillusioned by a lack of economic opportunity, a problem that originated in Japan after their economy stagnated in the early 1990s, but has since spread to other parts of East Asia and the developed world. The final bucket is technological, specifically about the mechanics of how new isekai are created. Isekai stories come from a uniquely fan-driven environment on the Japanese website Shousetsuka ni Naro, and it's that crossover between consumers and producers that creates a virtuous cycle by which isekai continue to be churned out. To start with the psychological dimension, it's useful to confront the broader philosophical question of why do we consume fictional narratives at all? On the surface, it seems like a trite or even idiotic question, but the more you think about it, the more the answer is perhaps not as self-evident as it might initially seem. By definition, fictional stories are not real. So why then do we as a species invest so much collective effort, time, and brain power to the pursuit of stories, worlds, and characters that are completely made up? After all, thinking about fictional narratives wouldn't have helped our ancestors hunt great beasts or avoid dangerous predators. One answer to this question is that perhaps a predilection towards fictional narratives may have in fact helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. In psychology, there's an idea called theory of mind, which essentially refers to our ability to understand others by ascribing motives, emotions, beliefs, and desires to them that are different than our own. Individuals who are better able to understand the intentions of others, both good and bad, are much more likely to avoid undesirable outcomes, like being ostracized from your village, and more likely to achieve desirable outcomes, like procreation. In her 2006 book, Why We Read Fiction, the literature and cognitive science scholar Lisa Sunshine argues that theory of mind is essential for understanding why we are driven to consume fictional stories. By nature, all fictional stories require engaging theory of mind. To this end, Sunshine proposes a thought experiment to imagine how fiction would work in a world in which there is no conception of theory of mind, a world in which we are unable to conceptualize how others might have different thoughts, desires, and motivations from our own. Sunshine argues that in such a world, the role of fiction would be significantly diminished, if not completely eliminated. Intuitively, this makes sense. If we were completely incapable of understanding other people's inner workings and how their thoughts might differ from our own, there is a little reason to spend time absorbing made-up tales about other people. Sunshine's core contention throughout her book is that our drive to consume fictional narratives is driven by a desire to exercise our social reasoning and imagination. She analyzes literary classics like Beowulf, Don Quixote, or Lolita to show how they employ rhetorical tricks to exercise and stimulate our theory of mind. For example, take the case of Lolita, which centers around Humbert's obsession with the titular Lolita. The story forces readers to understand that Humbert is an unreliable narrator, requiring the reader to perform the mental exercise to understand how his predilections and neuroses color the narrative that's presented to them. In short, we have an evolutionary drive to process and understand the mental states of others that is mediated through fiction. So what does this have to do with isekai? I'd argue that the mechanics of isekai can help to enhance theory of mind. The central premise of isekai, of course, is it's where a person from our world finds themselves transported into some other fantastical world. What's interesting about many of the highest rated isekai, like Youjo Senki or No Game No Life, is that the protagonists all come from very distinct pre-isekai experiences. Tanya Degurachov was a cutthroat salaryman who was murdered by a disgruntled former employee he fired. Shiro and Sora are not just needs, which is a fairly common trope among isekai protagonists, but rather they're defined by their obsessive skill and compulsion towards game playing. These characters all carry defined and clear experiences and temperaments into their new lives, such that the viewer is forced to reason about how someone with those characteristics and background would approach the novel and fantastical situations thrown at them in their new reality. A common plot device in isekai stories is having the main character's knowledge and experiences from our reality translate into success in the fantasy world, which naturally encourages the viewer to think about how the experiences of the main character or even themselves would translate into the fantasy world. An increasingly popular subgenre of isekai stories are reincarnation villainess works. Essentially, these works will feature the protagonist being reborn as a character from one of their favorite books or video games from their previous life. They then use their knowledge of said book or game that they got reborn into to influence the plot. In essence, the mechanics of having a person from our reality transported into a fantastical one can help enhance the kinds of perspective taking that allow us to enjoy fiction. Of course, one of the primary criticisms of isekai stories is that most of them do not feature these kinds of unique or particularly memorable characters. The kinds of lowbrow, cookie-cutter isekai stories that have made these plot devices widely ridiculed are scorned because these stories are seen as uninspired and feature bland, unmemorable characters. While many of the genre's best shows feature characters with clearly defined and unique personality traits and experiences, these are perhaps the exception rather than the norm. One of the defining characteristics of lowbrow isekai stories is that they usually feature completely unremarkable, bland, milquetoast protagonists, usually with a predilection towards light novels, anime, or games. They then, very conveniently, find that these traits allow them to become extremely overpowered in their new life. The supporting cast is often little more than a pastiche of well-trodden anime tropes, and the plot generally fares not much better, with these kinds of stories trotting out the same warped RPG elements and generic fantasy settings. It's with these kinds of stories that the theory of mind explanation starts to fall apart. This kind of narrative setup does not particularly challenge one's theory of mind. The entire purpose of having these kinds of protagonists is for the viewer to self-insert into them. None of these characters typically have any kind of deeper character motivations for the audience to understand or dissect. This leads into perhaps one of the more prominent reasons why isekai tropes have stuck around for so long, namely that they encourage transportation into narrative worlds and identification with the protagonist. As the name implies, transportation into narrative worlds, or transportation theory, as it's sometimes referred to in the literature, refers to the ability of a fictional work to fully immerse or transport the viewer into a narrative. If you've ever, for instance, binged an entire season of anime without any regard for the time, you've experienced narrative transportation. When someone is strongly transported into a narrative, they often lose track of their surroundings and the real world, and they become highly engrossed and connected with the characters. Through scientific study, researchers have been able to identify distinct characteristics and factors that predict narrative transportation. In a 2014 meta-analysis, Tom Van Leyer and his colleagues examined 76 studies on narrative transportation. They identified several key characteristics of the story receiver, or the person reading, watching, or experiencing a narrative, and how those influence the likelihood of experiencing narrative transportation. First, they identify familiarity as a key driver of narrative transportation. The more knowledge a person has about a story topic or genre, the more narrative transportation they experience. To this extent, the mass proliferation of isekai works as a kind of virtuous cycle, where the ever-expanding universe of isekai stories only increases people's awareness and familiarity with the genre's conventions and tropes, and thus makes them even more likely to be transported into future isekai stories. Second, they point out that certain people are just inherently more willing to be transported. When you think about the typical isekai demographic, it's usually young men, often without much else going on in their lives. Thus, the specific demographic that isekai stories appeal to have an inherently high propensity for transportation. Third, they look at more general demographic characteristics. They find that young people are more likely to be transported, which checks out with the general isekai demographic. They also find out that more educated people are more likely to experience narrative transportation, likely as a function of the fact that they read more. Japan, as a society of a high degree of educational attainment, fits this bill. The final finding here is a little interesting. They find that women generally report higher levels of narrative transportation than men. While we often think of isekai as primarily appealing to young men, as I have likewise assumed, isekai as a plot mechanic has and continues to be quite popular with female audiences. One of the earliest instances of an isekai-style story was in the 1976 shoujo manga Oke no Mansho, or The Crest of the Royal Family, which revolves around a young girl being sent back in time to ancient Egypt. Isekai stories were quite popular in shoujo manga during the 1990s, such as Fushigi Yugi, a story about two junior high school girls that are transported back to ancient China from a book they find in their library. Of course, there's also the most famous example in Inuyasha, which features a girl who is transported to feudal Japan through a well in her family's shrine. And as I've previously mentioned, we've also seen a recent rise of Villainess isekai, which primarily appeal to women. However, many of the characteristics from Van Leer et al.'s study are not necessarily unique to isekai. The same demographic factors that make young men and women particularly likely to transport into isekai stories could easily apply to other types of narratives. For instance, before isekai became the in vogue genre, the early 2010s were heavily saturated by battle harem shows, exemplified by works like Date A Live, High School DxD, The Aztec War, or Chivalry of a Failed Knight, to name a few. Both battle harem shows and isekai share many similar characteristics. Both generally feature male protagonists that often seem plain or unassuming, but conveniently have some kind of unique power that makes them incredibly strong. Both are often ridiculed for being wish fulfillment fantasy shows for young men. However, there are a couple of subtle differences that account for isekai's enduring popularity, while battle harem shows have largely died out. The first is a bit on the nose, but isekai likely evokes better engagement from the viewers because of the literal plot device of the main character being transported into a new world. As I've previously argued, this act might make consumers more likely to become invested in and become narratively transported into the story. The second part of my argument is a bit more involved and has to do with the sociological conditions of particularly Japanese young people, but also an increasing share of young people globally. Specifically, I want to deconstruct a common criticism leveled at isekai stories, namely that they often devolve into vapid escapism and wish fulfillment for socially maladjusted young men and boys. It's worth interrogating what this contention means. What exactly are these people escaping from, and why has the narrative device of going to another world become the preferred means from which to execute this escapism? People regularly criticize what they perceive to be a glut of unoriginal and tropey isekai series without considering the underlying reasons why these stories continue to be successful. In her master's thesis, Fatuma Muhammad argues that isekai consumption has become endemic not as what she calls a, quote, ill-advised coping mechanism or as a sign of failure to launch, end quote, but as a reimagining of the coming-of-age tales of old. Isekai is particularly successful because it navigates the increasing unattainability of the idealized Japanese life for today's youth. A defining characteristic of most isekai is that the main characters are usually explicitly defined as being ordinary or unassuming in the real world. While there are some exceptions, like Tanya, who was once a reasonably successful businessman, by and large, these stories revolve around protagonists who have no real skills in their real lives except reading light novels and manga, watching anime, and playing video games. These protagonists are often hikikomori, or people who live excessively withdrawn lives and have little social contact and rarely leave their houses, a status exemplified by Rudeus from Mushoku Tensei. This contrasts starkly with the traditional shonen protagonists, people who are ambitious, driven, and constantly seeking to strengthen themselves. Even though a common trope of battle harem shows involves starring ostensibly forgettable or unassuming protagonists, these nobodies usually go through a fairly normal shonen protagonist arc of strengthening themselves and proving themselves to others. Consider, for instance, Chivalry of a Failed Knight. While the protagonist, the titular failed knight, is called so because of his inability to invoke magic, he masters a unique fighting style that allows him to defeat those who are supposedly much stronger than him. His arc revolves around him constantly overcoming challenges and proving his strength. On the contrary, modern isekai protagonists rarely seem to encounter meaningful obstacles or barriers. They transition seamlessly from people who are marginalized from real-world society as neat losers into veritable gods in the fantasy worlds they get transported to. Think of Ainz from Overlord or Sid Kagano from Eminence and Shadow. They are all granted essentially godlike powers and rarely encounter any meaningful challenges or threats to themselves. This characteristic of isekai stories as power fantasies is often criticized for being narratively lazy, which in all fairness it kind of is. One of the fundamental characteristics of good fiction writing is that your characters should encounter legitimate challenges that allows them to grow and change as characters. However, it's precisely because the characters are overpowered and encounter no meaningful challenges that endears them to the core isekai readership. Unlike in a traditional shonen story where the characters encounter seemingly insurmountable odds, but are ultimately able to triumph and grow as a result, the kinds of people that are drawn to isekai stories fundamentally don't buy into this notion of hard work being justified and rewarded. These are people that are often economically marginalized and, sometimes rightfully, observe that working hard is no guarantee of success in the real world. Some people work their asses off and reap little reward, while others seemingly continually fail upwards despite putting in no effort on their own. The popularity of this specific narrative style and form of escapism is a result of persistently poor economic conditions in Japan. Historically, the idealized notion of male adulthood in Japan revolved around a system of lifetime employment, or shushin koyo, where people are hired by a firm after college and work at the same company for the rest of their lives. The system was a product of the unique conditions of post-war Japan, where the country had a significant demand for labor to fuel its booming post-war economy, but much of the country's prime-age male working population died in the war. So to attract labor, companies would enter into these lifetime employment agreements, providing stable employment, pensions, and even housing assistance. In exchange for this job security, people are expected to extend that same loyalty back to the company by working long hours or even being willing to relocate across the country at your boss and the company's request. The obvious problem here is that this system relies on a steady rate of economic growth to sustain itself. If your employees are guaranteed a lifetime tenure, the only way to create new opportunities is to constantly expand and grow your business. This worked for the 40 years between 1950 and 1990, when the Japanese economy grew at a truly exponential rate. However, the system would come crashing down in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the collapse of the Japanese asset pricing bubble, which plunged the Japanese economy into a deep economic malaise that it has never truly recovered from. In response to the rapid contraction of the Japanese economy, the lifetime employment system that once defined Japanese working life had become completely untenable. During an economic recession, companies usually respond by firing and laying off workers, but Japanese firms didn't have this option due to their lifetime employment agreements. As sociologist Hiroshi Ono noted, Japanese firms instead responded to the new economic environment by freezing the addition of new lifetime employees in order to avoid having to lay them off. The end result of this was that the generation that graduated into the job market of the 1990s and beyond were confronted with the uncomfortable reality that the vaunted status of lifetime employment was simply no longer available to them. The 1980s marked the ascendance of so-called neoliberal economic policy in much of the Anglosphere, exemplified by the policies of Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, and Brian Mulroney in Canada. Neoliberalism is characterized by a focus on private enterprise and the free market. Neoliberal economics promoted reductions in government regulations and spending, privatization of formerly state-owned enterprises, and reductions in union power and greater flexibility in employment. It's this last point that's particularly relevant for the Japanese context. By the 2000s, these same policies had started to make their way over to Japan. In 2001, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party proposed the succinctly named Basic Policies for Economic and Fiscal Management and Reform, better known as Honnebuto no Honshin, or literally the Big-Boned Policy. Designed to right Japan's ailing economic ship, the Big-Boned Policies were a set of neoliberal reforms put into practice by Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, who served as Prime Minister of Japan from 2001 to 2006. Among them was the privatization of the Japan Post and reductions in industrial subsidies. Persistently weak economic conditions also gave Japan's major business interests much more leverage, allowing the weakening of labor laws that were designed to protect the lifetime employment system. The end result of all of these economic reforms was the effective end of lifetime employment for people who came into the workforce after the 1990s. While those who were grandfathered into lifetime employment arrangements were largely able to keep their jobs, new workers increasingly had to rely on part-time employment or non-standard employment arrangements that provided none of the economic stability and benefits provided by lifetime employments while keeping all of the terrible working hours and expectations of Japanese work culture. Between 1990 and 2001, the percentage of young people between the ages of 15 to 34 that were classified as freeters, or young people that were either unemployed, stuck in part-time, or temporary employment arrangements, more than doubled from 10.4% to 21.2%, amounting to more than 4 million people in 2001. This problem has only gotten worse in recent years. In 2022, the percentage of people stuck in part-time, contract, or other irregular work agreements has ballooned to nearly 40% of the entire Japanese workforce. By contrast, part-time workers make up less than 20% of the US workforce. This increasing reliance on part-time labor has led to extremely depressed wage growth in Japan, with average wages having increased only 11.7% between 1995 and 2020, whereas average wages have jumped over 50% in that same period in the US. In 2013, the Japanese government passed a law designed to address the increasing divide between lifetime employees and irregular employees, mandating that employers transition their irregular employees into lifetime employment after 5 years, and stipulating that the employment conditions should not have, quote, unreasonable differences. Unfortunately, this law has been effectively moot because the definition of unreasonable has been construed so broadly by the Japanese legal system as to effectively render this law unenforceable. Given it's essentially impossible for many Japanese youth to access these kinds of vaunted lifetime employment agreements that once characterized the rite of passage into adulthood, is it any wonder then why so many young people have rejected conventional norms of growing up and entering the real world and are instead retreating into the fictional worlds of isekai. By no fault of their own, these people are bored into a culture that has not caught up to the current economic reality. Expectations for men in Japanese society have largely not changed over the years, with men expected to graduate into the workforce and work long hours to support a family that they often rarely get to see. Even if these jobs were attainable, many people are rightfully questioning whether the lifetime employment system was truly the ideal it was held up to be. If you've ever watched one of those day in the life of a Japanese ex on YouTube, you'll probably see what I mean. The day in the life of an average Japanese salaryman in Tokyo is genuinely depressing, with the subject of the video working nearly 14 hours from 7 AM to 9 PM. Despite the fact that Japan is often held up as a modern and advanced society, their working culture is shockingly antiquated. Fax machines are still a regular fixture in a Japanese office, despite the fact that most of these machines are probably older than I am. As someone who does business for Japanese clients for my day job, I often find myself scratching my head at some of their business as usual practices. Of course, the realm in which this is the most problematic is in work-life balance, or lack thereof. Even though companies are increasingly relying on irregular workers, the total share of work to go around has largely not changed, a problem that is worsened by the weird reluctance of many Japanese firms to adopt modern labor-saving technologies. This results in employees being forced to work longer hours in suboptimal conditions for worse pay and benefits. Traditional Japanese firms are heavily hierarchical, mired in bureaucracy, and prioritize face time in the office over actual productivity. It isn't exactly a secret that Japan has an exceptionally brutal working culture, with the language literally having a term, karoshi, for death from overwork. Admittedly, a lot of the most undesirable factors of Japanese work culture have gradually improved in recent years. COVID especially forced a lot of Japanese firms to wildly diverge from what were sometimes decades-long entrenched norms. But the broader point about a lack of economic opportunity still remains. Japan has been trapped in a decades-long cycle of deflation, resulting in wages that have barely budged since the 90s. This criticism that isekai is a lazy plot point designed to appeal to maladapted young men isn't unique and has been a recurring part of the anime manga discourse for decades. Indeed, the term otaku as a term to describe someone who is obsessed with anime and manga originated in this context. The first instance of otaku being applied to anime manga fans is usually traced back to a column written by Nakamori Akio in the lolicon magazine Manga Buriko, in which he ran a short-lived column called Otaku no Kenkyu, or Otaku Research, in which he denigrates otaku as immature and dysfunctional weirdos who are unwilling to grow up and have normal relationships with women. We should probably not be surprised that isekai has stuck around for as long as it has, because it's simply a direct method of appealing to one of the core attributes of the otaku demographic for decades. The preeminence of recycled isekai stories is merely an evolution of a phenomenon that has been present in anime since the 90s. In his seminal 2001 book, Otaku: Japan's Database Animals, author Azuma Hiroki makes a central claim that the defining characteristic of otaku is that they no longer consume so-called grand narratives and instead focus on database consumption, where anime manga fans eschew complex stories in favor of consuming less complex content focused around the constituent elements of the narratives, such as familiar character archetypes and plot points. Lowbrow isekai stories are essentially the epitome of database consumption, where authors construct their stories from a database of familiar isekai tropes, resulting in a glut of familiar or otherwise unoriginal isekai stories that have flooded the landscape. While the particular socio-economic factors that have contributed to the rise of isekai originated in Japan, I'd argue that one of the reasons that isekai has remained such a dominant player in the anime, manga, and light novel landscape is because these kind of escapist power fantasy narratives increasingly have transnational appeal instead of merely appealing to the unique dysfunction of the Japanese economy. We're seeing a similar story play out in much of East Asia, including China and Korea. In both countries, we've seen a rapid rise of power fantasy web novels that have many of the same trappings of Japanese isekai, such as ridiculously overpowered protagonists and repetitive genre conventions. Much like Japan, China's days of rapid economic growth are behind it, with youth unemployment now a rampant problem. Official youth unemployment statistics apparently climbed so high to a record 20% that the Chinese government decided to just stop releasing youth unemployment statistics. In South Korea, the situation isn't much better, with the country carrying on many of the most antiquated and toxic elements of Japanese work culture. In the Western world, we're seeing a separate phenomenon where young men in particular increasingly struggle to find purpose and value. For men aged 25 to 54, labor force participation rates in the US have declined from 98% in 1954 to 89% in 2024. This decline has been particularly pronounced for men without a college education. While men with a college degree have a labor force participation rate of 94%, men with only a high school degree sit at 85.77%, with this declining even further to 81% for those without a high school diploma. Meanwhile, young men have rapidly fallen behind in educational attainment. Women now make up 60% of all college students, and are now substantially more likely than men to graduate at all levels of education. As a 20-something-year-old living in America, one of the trends I've noticed among people my age is a deep sense of pessimism about not just their own prospects, but also about the trajectory of society in general. There's often a deep sense of hopelessness, particularly on economic issues like housing affordability and wage growth. Even among people who are ostensibly well off, complaints from Zoomers or younger millennials about how they'll never own a home or be able to support their family are extremely common and widespread. It used to be that when you asked kids what they wanted to be when they grow up, they'd give you a somewhat far-fetched but otherwise normal profession, like doctor, teacher, firefighter, astronaut, etc. But nowadays, when you ask that same question, the most common answer is that kids now want to become social media influencers. Of course, most of them presumably grow out of this and face reality, but it's an interesting reflection of how the young are increasingly skeptical towards the traditional paths of economic success. The broader sociological point I'm getting at is that while it's easy to deride lowbrow isekai stories as merely the product of laziness and consumers with bad taste who insist on consuming the same escapist power fantasies each season, it's worth interrogating what exactly it is these people are escaping from, and why these kinds of explicitly escapist stories have become more and more common across a variety of cultures. The consumption and preference for these kinds of isekai stories can be seen as a kind of resistance to increasingly unattainable traditional norms of getting a quote-unquote good job, settling down, and raising a family. The core story structure of isekai is deeply appealing to the kinds of people who feel trapped by an economic system they feel does not work for them. It's not a coincidence that the protagonists of isekai stories are almost always young people who are defined by society as being inept and undesirable. They are often obsessive gamers or neets who have little in the way of traditional educational or job success. Yet these characters are able to find the kinds of success, belonging, and meaning in the new worlds they are transported to. More saliently, it's often the very characteristics that make them undesirable in the real world, like their obsession with games, anime, or manga, that make them so successful in their new realities. Take Sora and Shiro from No Game No Life, who are transported into a world literally designed for them to use their game playing skills. take Irons from Overlord, whose obsession of a dead MMO transforms him from a dead-end life as a salaryman into one of the most powerful figures in his new reality. Look at the large number of Villainess stories where the main character's obsession with whatever particular game or story they get trapped in becomes critical to their survival and success. The world of Isekai provides young people disillusioned with the harsh realities of our world with an idealized alternative reality where their skills and predilections are rewarded and celebrated. A final point that helps to understand the nature and persistence of isekai is the unique method by which isekai light novels, and later then manga and anime adaptations, are produced. Before the advent of the internet, aspiring mangaka or light novel authors would submit their works to literary contests that major publishing houses would hold, and if your story tickled their fancy, they would pick up your manga or light novel for serialization. However, this started to change during the mid-2000s with the advent of the internet. In 2004, the website Shousetsuka ni Naro, or literally Let's Become a Novelist, was launched. For convenience, I'll be referring to this website by its domain name of Shousetu, because the full name is a mouthful. As the name implies, the website is a platform where people can post their light novels for others to read. Most famously, while not actually published on Shousetu, Sword Art Online originated as a self-published web novel on author Kawahara Reki's personal website from 2002 to 2008 before being picked up by ASCII Media Works in 2009. The breakout success of SAO essentially opened the floodgates for web novel adaptations, particularly those from Shousetu. Since 2010, a huge number of isekai stories from the website have been adapted into manga and anime. Just to name a few, Log Horizon, Rising of the Shield Hero, Konosuba, Mushoku Tensei, Slime Tensei, Overlord, and Isekai Cheat Magician all originated on the website. Shousetu has even given us some non-isekai stories, like Alia sometimes hides her feelings in Russian, or I Want to Eat Your Pancreas. Much like how the protagonists of isekai stories eschew the typical conventions of success in the real world, the authors of isekai works themselves have come to prominence by foregoing the typical conventions of literary success. Unlike traditional publishing and media, which is full to the brim with gatekeepers, most writers on Shousetu presumably started as readers and purveyors of isekai fiction, which drove them to write their own stories on the website. What stories get picked up by big publishing houses is ultimately often a function of how popular a story is on the website, rather than the opinions of some literary agent or editor. Isekai stories are, at their core, written for and by the same audience, with consumers of isekai fiction frequently crossing over into producers of said fiction. The interplay between fans and creators that defines the modern isekai pipeline is a prime example of what the University of Southern California professor Henry Jenkins describes in many of his seminal books on media studies, such as his Textual Poachers, Convergence Culture, and Participatory Culture in a Networked Era. Jenkins' publication of Textual Poachers in 2003 essentially single-handedly willed the serious studies of fans into the academic discourse. Jenkins' central point in Textual Poachers is that rather than thinking of fans as brainless consumers, social outcasts, emotionally immature, or fundamentally divorced from reality, he makes the case that fans are actually active producers of meaning, who construct their own culture out of elements poached from various texts. Likewise, while it's easy to think of consumers of isekai as similarly brainless or out of touch with the reality, these isekai fans have become shockingly integral to the light novel, manga, anime industrial complex. Through their active poaching of different character archetypes, settings, and plot points into new texts on Shousetu, isekai fans produce serious monetary and cultural value through their endeavors. The development of new isekai stories is a largely bottom-up phenomenon driven by fan publication on Shousetu rather than a top-down one where media executives decide what kind of media to produce. Shousetsuka ni Naro is also an interesting microcosm of what Jenkins termed participatory culture, an idea he introduced in Textual Poachers and subsequently refined and built on over the years. In a 2007 white paper, Jenkins gave the following definition of participatory culture. A participatory culture is a culture with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, strong support for creating and sharing one's creations, and some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. A participatory culture is also one in which members believe that their contributions matter, and feel some degree of social connection with one another, or at least they care what other people think about what they have created. The characteristics of the kind of participatory culture fostered on places like Shosatsu or other online web fiction publishing platforms is diametrically opposed to the kinds of characteristics and values that these people encounter in their real lives. While access to good jobs and success in our world is heavily gatekept and restricted, Shosatsuka ni Naro provides a platform by which anyone can write and theoretically become successful. Familiarity with light novels, manga, and anime is something that actually aids in your success in this arena, rather than being a source of scorn and ridicule like in the real world. Publishing online and receiving comments from readers provides a sense of meaning and social community that many of these people lack in their real lives. Given this, it's not surprising that most isekai stories start out in this kind of direct-to-consumer web fiction model, instead of traditional models of media creation where business executives or editors determine what kind of works they think will appeal to the public. It's a naturally self-reinforcing cycle, where the kinds of people drawn to isekai stories congregate on places like Shosatsu, producing popular works that draw in new people that are ultimately remixed and built upon into new isekai stories. Two of the characteristics about participatory cultures that Jenkins highlights in his 2015 book is that participatory cultures are inherently democratic and diverse. Shosatsu and other web fiction publishing platforms like Royal Road, Archive of Our Own, Wattpad, etc. have enabled thousands of socially and economically marginalized people to bring their own stories to the public, while the anime manga industry has long revolved around fan participation, exemplified by the bi-yearly ritual of Komiket, where hundreds of thousands of people gather in the Tokyo Big Sight to sell self-published bojinshi. The internet radically lowered barriers of entry and democratized who could have creative success. Whereas previously you had to depend on the whims of editors and suits at the major publishing houses to give your manga or light novel a chance, the internet gives everyone that chance to prove the success and popularity of their own ideas. The process of sidestepping traditional gatekeepers and creative success to instead appeal directly to individual consumers is an interesting reflection of the psyche of the core isekai readership. The kinds of people who feel marginalized and left behind by an economic system that they feel no longer works for them essentially created an entirely new paradigm for creative success in the anime manga industry, a symbolic rejection of the traditional norms of success, and a prime example of how fans proactively create meaning rather than being just passive consumers of media. The rise of isekai is interesting because it's both a product of the story itself and the macro trends affecting much of the developed world. These stories are narratively effective because the prime narrative concept of having a character transported into a different world is essentially equivalent to the psychological action that one takes when you enjoy a fictional story. But the broader point I'm trying to make, and indeed the one I spent most of my time on, is interrogating what is exactly meant by the common critique of isekai as wish fulfillment or escapism. What exactly are the kinds of desires these people are trying to vicariously fill through their anime, manga, and light novel consumption? What exactly are these people trying to escape from in their day-to-day lives? The case I'm making is that the enduring popularity of isekai is driven by a complex constellation of economic, sociocultural, and technological trends. And until the underlying trends pushing young people towards wish fulfillment media, namely bad economic conditions and lack of opportunity, improve, we're likely to continue seeing isekai remain the top dog of the anime, manga, and light novel landscape.